All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. I got the green light, so here we go. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I am so excited to have Rich with us, and his talk is jointly organized by IBS's International Development Program and the Security Studies Speaker Series of the Department of Political Science. I don't think Rich needs any introduction, and any introduction that I'm going to make today will not live up to his very exciting research program, but I will try to do it anyway. And needless to say, he has been very, very productive over the years. He's the only guy that I know who knows how many hours he puts into his research weekly. I wish I could do that, but he does, so that's pretty impressive. So only this year he has 2 AJPSS. One is about matching and the other one is about female preachers. And that second article that I just mentioned is coming from the book that he is currently working on Islamic authority in the internet age. And so he already has his book published in 2017 from Cambridge, and it has a very catchy title. I mean, I thought I could find catchy titles, but this one, I mean, it's over the top, Deadly Clerics. It's gonna stick. It's easy to remember. That's great. And so before I go ahead and have Rich get started, I want to highlight 2 of our graduate students here today. One of them is Komal and the other one is Rezban. If there are other graduate students, please, guys, speak up. All right, if I'm missing any graduate students in this crowd, please speak up so that Rich can remember you later. Komal and Rezvan, thanks for being here, and thanks everyone for being here. So, and the second book is still in the workings, so I wanted to say that, still in the workings. And his talk today is titled Conspiracy Theories in the Egyptian State-Controlled Press. So before further ado, Rich, take it away.
Great, thank you so much for that incredibly warm introduction. Half of those things aren't true, but I will accept them anyway. I'm going to share my screen here with the slides, and then we'll get right into it. All right, so this is, as was just mentioned, Conspiracy Theories in the Egyptian State-Controlled Press. This is a bit of an oddball project, perhaps, but as some of you who know me on this call know that I do oddball projects and I have trouble staying in a single box. In fact, I'm looking at a screen of scholars who I really respect, but actually from different literatures. Back when I wrote IPE literature, I'm seeing David and Adrian, and this is just reminding me that other people have stayed the course with a single research agenda, whereas I tend to bounce around. Hopefully this will at least be an interesting bounce for today. And I want to also acknowledge my co-authors who really have done the lion's share of the work. They're here on the call as well to correct me when I get things wrong. Gabe Kohler-Derrick and David Romney, and they're both postdocs this year and looking for jobs, so hire them. All right, so, or recommend them to your friends at the very least. So I'm teasing here with my title slide, the top of a conspiracy theory article in the #1 Egyptian newspaper. So I'll stop teasing it and just show it to you. Our question for this paper is, why do states promote conspiracy theories? And we got interested in part because of things like what I'm going to describe to you that you're seeing here now. So this is an article published in 2013 in Egypt during a very tense time. This is around the coup, and a time when the Egyptian government might have really wanted US support to avoid any problems. And instead we get this article which says, a new conspiracy shakes the peace, or to shake the peace, involving politicians, the journalists, and business persons. And I'll describe this again to you later. You'll see a paragraph from it later in the talk. But basically alleges a conspiracy between Ann Patterson, the ambassador to Egypt, with the Muslim Brotherhood to infiltrate prisons via tunnels from Gaza and release chaos on Egypt. This conspiracy theory makes no sense and is kind of a puzzling thing for the regime to be promoting right at this time in the state-run or the state-owned newspaper. So we're trying to work our way through this kind of phenomenon. Egypt's not the only place where this happens in China, happens in Russia, also Iran, Turkey, Venezuela, and increasingly, I think Americans are becoming aware that this may also happen in the U.S. Our media is structured in a different way, but certainly the spread and supply of conspiracy theories in U.S. media is also, I think, of great interest. The role of politicians in promoting those is maybe on everyone's minds right now. So I'm happy to talk about how I think this research relates to very pressing events that we're all experiencing. So not just about authoritarian states, although that's where we'll be focusing today. The plan of the talk is pretty straightforward. We're going to have a theory of the supply of conspiracy theories by states. I'm going to go light on the theory, honestly, because I'm so excited about the empirical parts of this project. Then I'll talk about the research design, how we're going to try to measure conspiracy theories in newspapers and then predict them in a statistical model. I'll show you some results. Those results are going to tell you that variation in institutions, and especially variation in crisis events, are going to drive the supply of conspiracy theories that we see. And I'll conclude with some takeaways, open questions, next steps. And really, this is a paper that needs a lot of improvement. And so I'd really like your feedback on how to do so. All right. To get into the theory, I first want to start with just kind of a definition of what we're seeing as conspiracism and conspiracy theories. It's a hard thing to define, and as we go to code it, it can sometimes be a little difficult. But we're going to borrow this definition from Oliver and Wood 2014, which really relies on three things: that there are unseen, intentional, malevolent forces that are the cause of political phenomenon, that politics is really a struggle between good and evil, and that the mainstream accounts of things are incorrect, are a ruse to hide what's really happening. Turns out there's a lot of existing scholarship on conspiracy theories. This is Google Scholar, which returned to me some 200,000 results. I have not read all of these results. So if you know of research that I ought to be citing that I'm not, please do let me know. We'd like to hear about it so that we can incorporate the latest. Here's where we are with our understanding of how we fit into this broad literature. So most of the literature focuses on the demand side for conspiracy theories and misinformation. We're going to focus on the supply side, remember. I'm just going to quickly review the demand side. The result out of here basically is that some people have a psychological propensity to conspiracism, and that telling them the truth rarely helps. In fact, can make it worse. And here's some citations that we can come back to if we need to, but I'm not going to review these, that basically support these claims. The literature on the demand for conspiracy theories in the Middle East is less well developed, and to our minds, not all of it's, if I can be honest, very good. So there's this is still a bastion of kind of culturalism in political science and related disciplines. So there's a set of writing that basically people in the Middle East are more prone because of Arab culture or Islamic culture or something to conspiratorial thinking. In fact, this book by Daniel Pipes, we think, is one of the main reasons people haven't worked on conspiracy theories in the Middle East, because citing Daniel Pipes is kind of a no-no. He's a controversial and I would say bigoted figure in Middle East studies. And so, as soon as I got into this and realized, oh, we're going to have to cite Daniel Pipes, my excitement level went down slightly. But the argument here is that basically, folks in the Middle East are just really prone to this stuff because of Arab culture, Islamic culture. We think that's wrong, and we'll show evidence that, there's substantial variation, that, if the cultural argument were right, there really wouldn't be variation, and just the levels would be high all the time. Work that we like better, Brendan Nahon and Thomas Seitzoff have a fairly recent paper looking at conspiracy theories about the West, Jews, and Israel, and they find that those are strongly associated with generalized anti-Western and anti-Jewish attitudes. Although this starts to feel a little circular, people believe bad things about the West and about Jews because they already believe bad things about the West and about Jews. So that's on the demand side. We think there's more work to do there in the Middle East, but we think really where work needs to be done is on the supply. And here, the main thrust of the literature is on authoritarian deflection. So coming from the Middle East, the book by Matthew Gray argues that authoritarianism is the main variable that matters. Recent paper by Lisa Blades and Alat El-Rababa argues that, again, in Syria, there's a lot of evidence of authoritarian diversion in the newspaper. And then outside of the Middle East, here are just a couple arguing that autocrats attempt to deflect from their failures by promoting conspiracy theories. Although this does not always work, or if it works, it may work in the short term, but then backfire in the long term by undermining trust and legitimacy. And here are, three of, many papers arguing that that this can happen. One of these is on misinformation or false denials, and two of them are on censorship. So what's our argument? We're building pretty directly on this literature, pulling pieces of it together. We think that in the absence of security crises, or crises more generally, governments are going to try to avoid that backlash effect that the literature has identified by keeping the supply of conspiracy theories low. So, a stable, secure government is not going to be promoting these through the news all that much. It's when crisis hits that conspiracy theories are going to be promoted. And then what happens is going to depend on the institutions in place. And the literature would suggest to us that authoritarian governments are going to supply more conspiracy theories during a crisis, and that democratic governments have less of a propensity than their authoritarian counterparts to provide, to supply conspiracy theories. And the micro foundations of that are basically that the authoritarian is interested in trying to deflect, to govern through fear, to create the sense that there are threats all around, and that this justifies certain excesses in repression and authoritarian behavior, whereas the democratic government is looking forward perhaps to the next election and saying, we don't actually want to go to the well of conspiracy theories quite that much, because it undermines the notion that we're in control, that things are stable, that this is a party or a set of candidates that you want to keep voting for in the future. I've kind of noted this already, that most of the literature takes this misdirection angle, but we also see an option for something we're calling messaging, where the authoritarian or the democratic government is trying to signal what their priorities are through promotion of certain conspiracy theories. So the way we think this would work out empirically is if misdirection is the goal, or the primary goal, of government promoted conspiracy theories, then we would see kind of scattershot conspiracy theories that are mutually contradictory, that involve a lot of different actors doing a lot of different things that may or may not line up, just kind of flooding. And this lines up with what Lisa Wedeen argues in her book about Syria very recently. Whereas if we're seeing messaging, then we'd see a very consistent set of conspiracy theories around a consistent set of actors that the messenger is trying to convince the audience are bad and are doing bad things, and make them the nature of the threat very clear. And for example, I would actually say that the QAnon conspiracy theory is vast and winding as its twists and turns is actually really messaging. It's about a pretty limited set of actors trying to convince people of what those actors are doing that's wrong and why they're bad and should be opposed at all costs, right? It's not just trying to like flood the airwaves so no one knows what to think at all. All right, so that's our argument in a nutshell, probably a bit underspecified, as I said, but I do want to jump to the empirics. I am happy to take questions at any time, although I'm somewhat bad at seeing the, oh, sorry, maybe I just went out of full screen view. I'm bad at seeing the list, so please let me know if you have a question. Feel free to jump in. All right, so on to the research design. So we're working in Egypt, as is clear from the title of the talk. This is a political map of Egypt from Google. But I think the night lights map of Egypt is actually more informative about its political geography. So you can see here we have basically the Nile coming up to the delta, and Cairo is right at the juncture of that delta. And so, really, if you look at the map, you see this vast desert space. But if you look at the night lights, you see where the population is and where the heart of Egyptian society is around that delta. This is the largest media market in the Middle East. So we think that understanding conspiracy theories in the leading newspapers of this media market is important in its own right. But it's not a randomly selected case. We don't have some like amazing case selection justification. I've spent time in Egypt. All of us speak Arabic. And so this seemed like an obvious place to get started. Our measurement strategy for detecting these conspiracy theories in print media is probably the thing that's taken us the most time. So we collected the full run of all articles from 2 papers, Al Ahram, which is a state-owned newspaper. It's the state-owned newspaper. And then the most prominent independent newspaper over the time period that we have started in 2005. I'll get to the details in a minute. That's called Al-Masri al-Yawm. It means the Egyptian today. We're then going to also measure our 2 key predictor variables, changing institutions and crisis events. Here we have to do less work than we do for detecting the conspiracy theory, so we'll return to that in a minute. But we're going to look at just changes in who's the executive. So we have 5 executives during this time, although the last 2, Adli Mansour is really just a figurehead for Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. And then we're going to measure crisis events, primarily using the ACLED events data set. But all of these events data sets have some issues, and so we're going to look also at the START terrorism data set. And here our goal really is to look at what are the types of events that would make a government feel like it was in crisis, like it needed to either deflect about its failures or a message about its threats, right? And the way we're going to analyze this data then is through regression and case studies. We don't have any fancy causal identification strategy. So half of you are welcome to leave the Zoom now. I'm sorry, I should have broadcast that at the beginning. But we do think we have cool data, and I'm happy to talk about why I think our results are still informative, even though we don't have random variation in any of our main predictor variables, either in the events or in the changing institutions. And I'd welcome thoughts about how to do that if that's of concern to you. So our regressions are mostly going to have the form where we are, as you can see, interacting the indicator for the state newspaper with either the events data or with the changing institutions, which I've denoted here periods. Actually, we're going to put them all in the same model because we can do that. What we think that interaction is doing is saying, okay, if an event happens, so a terror event happens or a riot happens or a protest happens, does the government oversupply conspiracy theories relative to the independent newspaper, which we're treating roughly as a baseline? And we can talk about why we think that's a fairly reasonable thing to do. But basically, if the elasticity for the state-run newspaper of events is stronger, then we think that the government is responding to events by trying to oversupply these conspiracy theories. And then the interaction with periods, basically we're going to see whether the state newspaper has different levels of conspiracy theories overall in these different periods as opposed to the independent newspaper. We're going to control for some basic things you'd want to do when you're thinking about like how our newspaper is structured. So we control for the day of the week, the number of paragraphs, and the number of articles in each newspaper. But we very open to more controls. We don't have a great set of controls for actually thinking about the supply of conspiracy theories or rendering events and periods fully exogenous. So suggestions are very welcome there. And then we have a couple of case studies, although really for this talk, they're going to be case sketches at best. So this is a photograph of a set of Egyptian newspapers, and conveniently for us, the ones we're going to pick are right at the top. We think that's actually in line with the Egyptian media space. So this is El Ahram in red and El Masr al-Yawm in blue. A little bit about El Ahram. This is taken straight from Wikipedia, and I underline the important parts. It's the most widely circulating. It's majority owned by the government and is widely accused of influence and censorship by the government. Okay. El Masr al-Yawm, in contrast, claims to provide objective news. You know, we take that with some grain of salt. So we're not treating this as like a completely definitive baseline of what, you know, what events actually happened in Egypt or anything like that. And we'll see in the analysis where its own politics may come into play. But it certainly has is aiming to be more independent and objective than El Ahram is. It's been around since 2005, and by 2009 was quite influential and widely visited online. We're pulling all of the articles we have from online archives, although we have confirmed that the articles did also appear in, or at least a spot check of articles did appear in the print editions. Okay, so how are we going to detect conspiracy theories then in these newspapers? So we have read a fair number of articles and paragraphs from these articles, but if we were to read them all, there's, you know, almost 10 million paragraphs that we're working with here, and this would be 19 years of reading nonstop if we started now. So this is why I'm into this project, is I do Arabic text analysis. So I have a thing that I do. We're going to take that thing and apply it to this problem. So here's what our solution looks like. First, we're going to trim down the set of articles we need to consider by using keywords to identify likely articles. And the reason we can do this is we're exploiting the fact that, unlike in the American media, where it's kind of distasteful or suspect to call something a conspiracy theory, like if you want to promote a conspiracy theory, you don't say, hey, I have this crazy conspiracy theory, let's talk about it. Whereas in the Egyptian news media, actually using the words conspiracy or trick, machination, collusion is very standard. In fact, almost necessary for talking about these events or these purported events. And so we we identify articles that have those keywords. That ends up being only 32,000 here. We have done some checks to make sure that those keywords are scooping up most of the conspiracy theories. They are scooping up the vast majority from our early tests, although we have more to do. Then we sampled some of these articles, 1,500 of them, hand-coded them by paragraph, saying, is this a conspiracy theory? And if so, is the writer endorsing the conspiracy theory, or are they being critical of it, right? Because we actually don't want to punish the state newspaper if what they were doing was, instead of promoting conspiracy theories, actually reporting on them and if they were trying to debunk them all the time. In fact, the research suggests that would still increase belief in conspiracy theories, but we could imagine that, you know, the reporters might think that would be an effective way to rebut them, and we don't want to count that as state promotion of conspiracy theories. We did this hand coding ourselves at first, and then we switched to some research assistants, Amani and Mehdi, from who are native Arabic speakers and from the region, because we felt like they would have a better sense we were worried that we weren't maybe picking up all the things that ought to be considered conspiracy theories. Then we train a classifier. In this case, we're using a random forest. I'm not going to talk about it much, but I'm happy to in the Q&A, and classify the rest. And this gives us really high accuracy, although that number is deceiving because actually if you just guessed not conspiracy for all of them, you'd be right 92% of the time. And so 97% is actually not that impressive. It is a detectable increase over random guessing, or what's called the no information rate. But really the number that I think is more telling about how we're doing is this 77% sensitivity, which means that if there's a conspiracy theory paragraph coded by a human in our set, we'll code that correctly as a conspiracy theory automatically 77% of the time, which is not amazing, but actually is in line with our coder disagreement between our two coders. So it's, we would say, as good as human coding. And we were able to do it in hours, right? So we're still working on improving this, but we think that the broad trends are going to hold even if we make some modest improvements to the classifier. And to give you a sense of what the totals look like, basically this comes out to around 2.5 paragraphs per day out of about 900 paragraphs total in each newspaper on average. So it's a very small percentage, 0.28%. And then at the highest point, if you look at the highest 7-day period point, this ends up being an Al-Ahram starting after the Port Said riot, which we're going to take a close look at later, where it's 17 paragraphs per day spread over 7 days. All right, sorry if I've been talking too fast here. Questions before I move on? All right, so what do the data actually end up looking like? On the x-axis, we have the date. Y-axis is going to be the moving average of conspiracy theory paragraphs. This is for Al-Ahram with a 14-day moving average. And this is for Al-Masri al-Yawm, same 14-day moving average. Is actually kind of hard to look at, so let's make it a 2-month moving average. But you can see it's very, very spiky, right? Certainly responsive to something other than just culture or institutions, because there's a lot of like day-to-day variation that's happening here. So this is what it looks like with the 2-month smoother. And here we can see now, well, okay, there's a lower period and then it ramps up, and then there's a dip and then it ramps up again. And then there seems to be kind of more divergence between the blue and the red lines, starting after about 2013, right? And already this starts to give you some sense of where our findings are going to go. Okay. Before we jump to correlating these conspiracy theories with things, I think it's more satisfying if you have a bit more of a sense of like what's in them. So here's, again, a paragraph from the one I talked about before with Ann Patterson and Hayat Shatter, and they're infiltrating to spread chaos in Egypt. But unfortunately for us, most of the conspiracy theories in this data set are not actually this precise. This is very well spelled out, like the theory of what's going on. You could code this as event data, just fictional event data. This is harder to code as event data, but this is what most of them look like. Kind of a vague accusation. We are facing a conspiracy and an enemy whose composition we do not yet know, a nebulous enemy, right? So to get a better sense then of like, okay, what do these look like on average? We started trying to connect, like, what are the common perpetrators and what are the common victims? Kind of what does that network look like? So we coded those by hand in the training set because we cannot figure out a way to code them automatically with any degree of accuracy from, from the whole corpus. And what you're seeing then is in each cell on the left here is a list of perpetrators, and on the right is a list of victims. And what we've done is we've taken all of the conspiracy theories in our training set and then clustered them using the k-means clustering algorithm, which I'm happy to talk about the details, but basically says which of these sets of actor combinations seem to group together automatically. And the bulk of them actually do not have like a common theme. So 971 of them, there's a bunch of perpetrators and a bunch of actors. And, we have some more coding to do, so we're going to try to dig into that more. But then it seems like the rest of them are really defined by either a perpetrator or a victim, but generally not actually both. So here's a cluster that's really about Egypt as the victim. Here's a cluster that's really about Israel as a perpetrator. Some focus on Egypt, but also others. Arabs as a victim, the West as perpetrator, with America coming in a strong second there, Syria as victim. And we could break this out into more clusters to try to like drill down into which subcategories of conspiracy theories are we getting. But what I think this means is that most of the paragraphs you'd read are really going to focus on one actor, and that actor is either going to be the victim or the perpetrator. And it's rare to have the Ann Patterson, Hayat Shatter, targeting Egypt conspiracy theory spelled out so clearly. Okay, we'll move a little quicker because of time. Here's what it looks like if we look at those same entities and just say, what is the proportion with which they appear as victims and perpetrators? And you can see that Egypt and the Egyptian people are always the victim. The proportion is 1 here. The Egyptian regime, interestingly, is in the middle. So it is both the perpetrator and victim in a number of conspiracy theories. And it appears somewhat less frequently than Egypt or the Egyptian people, but is like the 3rd most appearing actor in these conspiracy theories. And then Israel, America are almost always perpetrators. Terrorism, Qatar, the West, nebulous, etc. Okay, so that's measuring our outcome variable. Now we need to measure the predictor variables. So this is kind of a visual timeline of how the executive has changed over the last few years in Egypt. Mubarak, a dictator, the revolution overthrows him, and a military government installs itself. Then elections are held. Mohammed Morsi from the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood wins those. This is the period that we would call a democracy. That's contested in Egypt, right? Because a lot of people have strong political feelings about whether what the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood was doing was in fact democratic, but they were democratically elected in relatively free and fair elections. The coup happens in 2013. Ali Mansour, here in the white hair, is installed by Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, whose hand he's shaking. And then Abdel Fattah el-Sisi wins the election in 2014 in a landslide. That election is not deemed free and fair. There's not a lot of meaningful competition in that election. And then el-Sisi has been ruling, I would say, as an autocrat until now. And this is what that timeline looks like if we use alternating gray and white shaded regions on the kind of graph I've set up here. So we're going to call these breaks the breaks in institutions, although we realize that there's a lot of other things that are going on in this time frame that might correspond to those breaks. We also want to measure events, things like the Egyptian Revolution. Here's a picture of a bombing at a Coptic church, or counterterrorism operations in the Sinai. So this is what the ACLED event data set for Egypt looks like over this time period. If we smooth it out a little bit more, so it's slightly less spiky, this is what we see. If we overlay that with the time periods, you can see that changes in the level of events really do correspond with changes in who is the executive of Egypt and what are the institutions. But there's a lot of variation that's not explained by time period either. And then we're going to use these two variables to predict variation in conspiracy theories. All right, on to the results. So we're going to eyeball it first, because I do want to actually give you a sense of like the correlations that we're going to see in the regressions are actually there in the data. At least we think we've convinced ourselves that we can eyeball them in the data as well. So this is overlaying the plot from the newspaper conspiracy theory counts with our main predictor variables, just adding that in. And this is a little hard to eyeball, but if we take the average for each time period for each newspaper and add that as these blue and red dashed lines corresponding to each newspaper, you can see that at least the changes in the time periods do correspond to pretty striking variation in the supply of conspiracy theories by each of the newspapers over time. The biggest flip really being here when Mohamed Morsi is elected or takes office, actually, is when this gap is defined as the president of Egypt. More on that in just a minute. I'll explain what I think these differences mean. If we turn now to the regressions, we're actually going to use this interaction term to recover basically the same dashed lines that we saw before, but we'll be recovering them, controlling for other things, and also being able to estimate the interaction with events. So netting out the variation that's explained by events, riots, etc. And so this is what those coefficients look like. Again, blue coefficients for Al-Masr al-Yawm, that's the independent newspaper, red for Al-Ahram. And basically, the story that we think is going on here, if I were going to tell it in Egypt-specific nouns, well, without Egypt-specific nouns, we'd say, yes, at least the hypothesis that changing institutions change the supply of conspiracy theories, that is confirmed. Now, is it the case that democracy explains the supply of the changing supply of conspiracy theory institutions? You might want to say yes, because actually in the one democratic period here, it really drops for the state newspaper. But I think that might be, well, definitely overclaiming. I mean, basically, we've got like one data point there that happens to fit what our theoretical argument is, but is not airtight evidence there. And so I definitely don't want to overclaim. But what we think is happening with Egypt-specific nouns is that prior to the revolution, both newspapers supply conspiracy theories at roughly the same rate, and that's a low rate. So the autocratic government feels secure, feels stable, and basically has a little incentive to pump these things through. After the revolution, maybe everyone becomes a bit conspiracy theorist. I was in Egypt during this time and certainly got asked if I was CIA quite a bit as I was muddling around as a grad student, mostly getting myself into trouble. So here the levels are universally high, and maybe they're high for different reasons across the newspapers, but certainly the government has mixed incentives about whether it wants to promote these or not. But then when Mohamed Morsi is elected, we think that the Muslim Brotherhood really does not want to be promoting conspiracy theories because it wants to project a sense of stability again, that like democratic rule is legitimating it, and that it wants to get reelected. It does not want the coup that ends up happening. And so it's trying to tamp these down, whereas the independent newspaper seems to be pumping them out, and a lot of them are aimed at the Muslim Brotherhood, as we'll see. This flips with the coup in mid-2013, and so first Adli Mansour with Assisi behind him, and then Assisi himself, basically is pushing really high rates of conspiracy theories. And even when this falls, even as events decline, Assisi is still pushing these through the state-run newspaper at a pretty high rate. We think, again, trying to justify repression. All right, turning to the other interaction term in our model, what we would expect to see here is that Al-Ahram oversupplies when threatening events happen to the regime, and that's what we find. This is the linear interaction. So what we're seeing is that for Al-Masr al-Yawm, there's a slight increase as the sum of events over the last 7 days goes from 0 to 150. And I've put here a histogram of the density of that variable as well, so that you can see the bulk of the action in the variable is down here below 50 events in the last week, but that there is some data, up here in the tail. Obviously, the confidence intervals get wider. Whereas Al-Ahram is fairly responsive to the sum of events. Basically, if there are more events in the past week, it provides, 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 additional conspiracy theories per per day. But following suggestions of my former colleague Jens Heinmuller, we decided to check whether this interaction was linear or not. It turns out it in fact is not. This is a thing you'll want to go home and check with any regression models you're running with interactions as well, because they have some pretty devastating takedowns where they show that people misinterpreted their models by constraining it to be linear when the relationship is highly nonlinear. The way this interaction looks for us is we're going to include the squared and cubed term of the events data set. And this is going to allow the relationship by newspaper to vary non-linearly with the total number of counts in the last 7 days. And that's what the relationship now looks like. So we're still seeing the predicted conspiracy theory counts here on the side and the histogram, but basically actually the bulk of the action is here where the bulk of the data is. There's a pretty big difference in the slopes right here between El Ahram and El Masr al-Yawm. Then there's this flat section from 50 to roughly 100 events in the last 7 days where neither newspaper appears to be particularly responsive to those by supplying more conspiracy theories. And then when a lot's going on, like things are really going down in Egypt, there's this big divergence, although the data is fairly thin out here. So I want to be careful about making too much of that. So the final test we've done, and I'm springing this on my co-authors, they haven't even seen it yet. So that'll freak them out. By the way, that's also why I didn't have a paper to distribute, is I got these results done and was like, I'll write the paper during election week. This will be a really good idea. And let me tell you, the last week has not been as productive for me as I anticipated. So here we are with the slide deck and results that my collaborators haven't seen. So when I split this regression out by democratic and non-democratic periods, or I'll call them non-elected and elected governments in Egypt, what this is doing is basically trying to do a three-way interaction between the institutions and the events and the newspaper to see if the relationship, the responsiveness of the state newspaper to events is conditioned by whether the government is democratic or not. And we do find very different patterns, but I'm still trying to work out what to make of them. So I show them to you with a somewhat open interpretation. Basically, for the non-elected governments, we see roughly the same pattern we saw before, where there's a big gap, but actually El Masr al-Yawm is even less responsive to the sum of events over the last 7 days. You could basically draw a straight line through that curve, whereas El Ahram is responsive. So we think it's trying to deflect. And here we're seeing the flip. Now I realize I've completely mismanaged time. I actually did time this out, but apparently got too excited with the asides as I'm giving it live. So I'll just go through the results from the case studies very, very quickly. What we see when we look at the Muslim Brotherhood, which is, I think, the most important actor to be looking at, is a lot of flipping, where the independent newspaper accuses the Brotherhood a lot more while it's in power than when the Brotherhood is out of power. After the coup, El Ahram increases accusations substantially and never declines, even though the independent newspaper declines its conspiracy theories about the Brotherhood causing trouble pretty dramatically. So we take this as evidence for messaging, that this is about the threats that the government faces, rather than just trying to flood the airwaves and completely misdirect. Our other case that we've looked at is a massive and tragic soccer riot that happened in 2012, where a number of fans were killed because police refused to open the stadium gates. This corresponds to really the peak of conspiracy theory supply in at least El Ahram. And what we find is that the overall volume is comparable between the papers, but that most of them are in agreement that a conspiracy happened against Egypt and that there's criticism of the Ministry of Interior and the police. And the main difference being that the independent newspaper is more likely to accuse the interim government of complicity. But what we take from this is actually the dog that didn't bark. There again is not a lot of trying to kick up dust about random conspiracy theories from the Egyptian government paper here. This would have been a prime time, I think, for misdirection, and we don't see a lot of it. So our take-home messages: we think that whether we've convinced you with our findings or not, the supply of conspiracy theories is an important puzzle, and not just in the United States, where it's been primarily studied over the last 4 years since the 2016 election brought a lot of misinformation research to the minds of political scientists. We think we show that conspiracy theory supply varies with crisis events pretty strongly, and that this is inconsistent with the cultural demand explanation, or inconsistent with the explanation that it's just institutions, that autocracies provide these things and democracies don't, and that's all you need to know. And then our case studies seem to show more messaging than misdirection, although I think that that interpretation could, you're welcome to dispute it. We can talk about it in the Q&A. Some of the things we think are open questions, I actually won't go through all of these because I want to get to the Q&A, and I am sorry about taking too long. But on the messaging and misdirection, I think the open question here for us is, well, what if you misdirect by really focusing on just one actor? We would call that messaging, but maybe that is a form of misdirection. And how would we conceptually separate that out? And how would we know? And for our next steps, the things we want to do involve a number of, hopeful improvements to our models, and we would welcome all of your input on that. But also, we're very interested in applying this approach to other newspapers, other countries. I've actually already started working on this with a data set of conspiracy theory, of videos I have from alt-right protagonists on YouTube. And there the problem actually is that everything comes up as a conspiracy theory in the classifier because it is all fairly conspiratorial. And so we're trying to figure out how to detect just the Pizzagate conspiracy theories as opposed to labeling every sentence in that corpus. And so I'm happy to talk about what I think extensions look like or take your suggestions. And with that, I'm really looking forward to your feedback. And if I don't get time for your question, I am so sorry for taking too long. Shoot me an email and I'll welcome that.
All right, thanks, Rich. David is on my list, so David, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Rich. This is quite interesting, and I know so little about this. I think what I have is more of a comment than a question. I didn't want to interrupt the talk, but it has to do with the theory and design.
Yeah.
When I think about this kind of thing in the US context, okay, you've got an argument and you're careful, your question is states promoting this. And I don't know if that's a deliberate word choice, but you then use the word supply side. And when I think about this kind of thing in the US context, I don't think of for example, let's say the Trump administration as supplying the conspiracies. Rather, society, some group in society supplies them. The state could retweet. Okay, so my thought about Egyptian society here is that, and maybe this is not what you're implying. I just don't know this is the first I've heard the argument, but that it's not the Egyptian state supplying anything. It's conspiracy theories coming from society. And when you get to the research design, you're comparing a state-led newspaper and independent newspaper. But there are two things that could account for those differences. One would be, okay, so let's just say there's a background noise of conspiracy that one could report on. The state could actually be more enthusiastic, in which case it's promotion, or the independent newspaper could actively say, I'm not going to touch this stuff. And so the difference could be much more with independent newspapers saying, we're going to censor ourselves on these kinds of stories. And the thought, when you got to the research design, when you start to describe what's in these conspiracy theories, you have the Egyptian regime as a major actor here. And that's what made me kind of think about this, is that this is societal background noise, and there is differences in the reporting rate, but that difference in reporting rate does not imply that the state is necessarily doing much here. I'll shut up.
No, that is great. I love this comment. Let me see if I can go back to sharing the screen because I think it might help. So, well, I'm going to scroll through slides awkwardly. So this conspiracy theory, for example, that we led with is actually supplied by the state. So this phrase right here, kashafet masader amniya lil-ahram, means sources revealed to al-ahram that this is what was happening. And if you read further, those sources were from the Ministry of the Interior. So what's happening here, how this conspiracy theory got produced, is that someone from the government said, we are going to go to al-ahram and give them a tip that this is what's going down. And so we see this as direct government supply. On the flip side, I think you're right that a large number, I actually don't know how many, and now I wish I did, that's a task for us to find out. A large number of these are circulating conspiracy theories. For example, after the Port Said massacre, a lot of things were circulating, and then there could be differential propensities to pick up and report on those by the independent and state-run newspaper. And this is, I really appreciate you pointing this out because it gives us a direction to go to. I've been really thinking just of these like directly state supplied, where the newspaper actually says they were supplied by the state. But since most of them are more vague, I think you may be right that on balance, we should be much more careful about what we're thinking there and theorize it better. Awesome question. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, more questions?
I'll ask one.
Andy, go ahead. Yeah.
On sabbatical, so trying to keep a low profile, but thanks so much, Rich, for doing this. Very open-ended question. You can take this any direction you want. What's the role of social media here? Is there variation on social media, number of people on Facebook? Is that changing through time? Is that a source of conspiracies?
Yeah, it is, I think. And, you know, one of the problems that we're not sure how to deal with is that, you know, over time, the role of, you know, media changes a lot. So part of why we're doing newspapers is that, you know, we'd like to study conspiracy theories on Twitter, but Twitter didn't even exist when our time period starts, right? So we think we're holding some things fixed with our print media approach. Well, print now digitized and archived, to be clear. But yeah, I think that there is a lot with social media that may be driving changes. And like David was saying, I want to link these two, possibly serving up a lot more conspiracy theories for the state to deal with. So it is possible that the real difference between authoritarianism under Mubarak and authoritarianism under Sisi is not actually what we've said, which is that Mubarak felt very comfortable and didn't need to promote these, and Sisi doesn't feel comfortable and feels under threat and wants to heavily promote them, but rather actually that the media environment is just night and day different from those two time periods. I don't have a great way to suss that out, but again, a awesome question because it leads us in a direction of things we need to answer.
All right, Clara is next.
Hello, hi. Interesting presentation. I just had a question when you have the independent newspaper in Egypt for a baseline. I was wondering if you look at foreign papers, like whether in the Arabic region or, you know, BBC or something like that, that is interested in the region and how they cover this issue. You can have that as a robustness check or something like that.
I just muted myself, I'm sorry. Also a great suggestion. And so the difficulty, I'll be honest, in doing more newspapers is that I lost like a year of my life just trying to get these two newspapers in and cleared up. and I'm trying to decide how many years I've got in me. Now, the positive, like, and I hate to be the person who complains, it's like, my data was harder to collect than yours. But like, you would think that just like downloading the Egyptian newspaper would be not that hard. But oh my goodness, headaches. So we would like to do more newspapers. And actually, you know, one of our questions is, do we do more from outside the region, inside the region, Arabic speaking, inside Egypt? You know, what would be most convincing? And I think what I'm hearing you saying is, well, maybe regional baseline would really help us out here, give us something to ground against that isn't wrapped up in Egyptian politics. Now that we've got the infrastructure set up, I think we could think about adding more newspapers with it being a, you know, a maybe weeks long proposition, not months and years.
I'll go next while you guys make up your minds. So just I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment, but I see conspiracy theories, especially in authoritarian settings, as those that are that emerge as a reflex of the regime to protect itself. So the bigger question that I'm asking myself, because, you know, I mean, you mentioned a couple of settings in which this has taken place. Actually, there's a lot of them, especially in the Middle East. There is a lot of them. And the bigger question that I would ask myself is that this variation in conspiracy theories in the newspapers should be related to when the regime is feeling threatened. And I'm wondering if this is something that we can, I mean, transitions are threatening, that's for sure. And the transition is happening, regime transition is happening a lot in the Egyptian context. So I'm not sure if these two are kind of different, because, you know, when a ruler changes, there's a new ruler, well, the beginnings are always very threatening. But I'm wondering if you can say a few things about this, if this is something that you had in mind when you were putting together the research design.
Yeah, it is. And I would really welcome suggestions on how to better either conceptualize that threat or measure it. So I think what we ideally would know is, in the mind of the person who we think is feeding conspiracy theories to the media, how threatened do they think their boss is, right? Their boss being, you know, probably the executive of Egypt at the time. And right now, what we've done with the design is said, well, we don't know how threatened they feel, but we can see events that a government might perceive as threatening. So let's use these events data sets: terrorism, riots, protests, whatever. We thought we'd get more traction from separating out those types of events in the ACLED data set. We thought, oh, some events are more threatening than others, so that will really heighten the threat. We actually don't find that. We do find a difference when we look at deaths from those events. So certainly the more fatal events are, the more the government responds with conspiracy theories, as opposed to non-fatal events, it responds less strongly. But yeah, ideally we would have some, like, it's these variables where you want to know, like, the mind of the political actor and measure it somehow. And often text analysis can help us with that kind of thing, but the Egyptian government, as far as I know, is not writing about its threat perception, certainly not on a daily or weekly basis. But I'd very much welcome if there are other variables you think, or
no,
anyone
but I think Andy made a good point. I mean, one way to conceptualize threat, just like you said, you know, then looking at instance to see if some of them are kind of more intense than others, severe than others. That's definitely one way to do it, but it doesn't have to be like, you know, like deadly stuff going on. So I think Andy made a good point. If another conspiracy theory that's going to hurt the regime is circulating in social media, then the reflex of the regime would be to spread a counter conspiracy theory, obviously.
That is a really good point, and something that we should look into. We have not really looked into dueling conspiracy theories in this.
And this is, you don't want to be like, you know, the chicken egg kind of problem, you know, which comes first? Is it the social media first, like people talking about the regime and like and
Of
the
course.
regime wants to respond, I don't know where to start.
But maybe we can find some solution. I do think that dueling conspiracy theories happen.
Oh,
And we have been overlooking this empirically. We've basically assumed that they're somehow independent from each other. And
I think all that troll business on social media is all about, having a group of dedicated government supporters who are, like 24 hours a day responding to social media posts or tweets or whatever they prefer over there.
Yeah, you're right. And we've been overlooking this. No, thanks very much for that. I see that we are over time, so I really want to respect everyone's time. Thank you so much for listening, for the feedback, and really follow up if you have more comments or feedback. And if you ever decide to get into an Arabic text analysis project, or actually any text analysis project, do hit me up. I love talking about the methods side of this stuff too, like really, truly. I love hearing about new projects and trying to push them forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Rich.
All right.
David.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Rich. It was good to see everyone today. Take care, guys. Rich, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me and everyone for taking the time. I mean, really, like, to have more than 5 people on a Zoom call now, I'm just like, oh, wow, this is a big deal in people's days, because there's just so much Zoom to be had and so little time. And so I really appreciate everyone